But if you look at what Joel says, he goes on to say, in verse 25, I will restore to you the years that the locust has eaten. And, you know, literally, this is what God is doing in my life. That's literally happened. What had hindered me from the time when I came into the ministry in 1950, and the difficult years through, God has so blessed me. He's restored the years that the locust has eaten. And in verse 27, you'll know that I'm in the midst of Israel, that I am the Lord your God and none else, and my people shall not be ashamed. And we've seen how literally that has been fulfilled, that God is in the midst of Israel. Today, Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. Today, Israel is one of the most progressive and powerful nations in the world. Small, yes, but in actual, for its size, it carries more weight and has more prosperity than any other similar nation. And then in verse 28, and it will come to pass afterward that I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, your old men shall dream dreams, your young men shall see visions. And literally, that's what has happened. It's happened in my life, and what we've seen, and we've seen it in Russia, literally how that's been fulfilled in the former Soviet Union and all the areas and so many other places. It's happened. You can identify it. I was even talking with someone earlier today and being reminded of the outbreaks of revival that came at specific points, even in Britain. But the interesting thing is that what God is saying through the prophet in verse 29, on the servants and handmaids in those days will I pour out my spirit. And verse 30, I will show wonders in the heavens, the earth, blood and fire and pillars of smoke. And verse 31, the sun shall be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before the great and terrible day of the Lord come. So, this outpouring of the Holy Spirit was to come in the latter days and was to precede the return of Christ. Now, what I'm seeing is this, and I believe literally that we can see, we should see, and I am seeing. Look, if you look at my life, I've seen this in all these years, and all I can say is that from that small beginning in 1961, when I returned from Jerusalem, something had changed. Up until that time, yes, my evangelism had been small. But from that, everything was to expand and change. And of course, in those coming years, I was to see, great revivals. I mean, I was there when the revival came in Hungary under communism. I was there in Bulgaria when the revival swept the whole nation. Coming out of those early meetings and the most powerful things, and of course we've seen revival come in Russia, in the Ukraine, and in so many other countries where we've ministered. So God has honored this. But the point I'm trying to make is this, that whereas in the first rain following the day of Pentecost, the church began born in a blaze of fire and power, and those early disciples in the Acts of the Apostles, look what they did. They went out and they preached everywhere. There were miracles, there were healings. It's absolutely incredible what happened in the Acts of the Apostles. And what I'm seeing and believing is that the fire that to me fell in Jerusalem in 1961, and which so transformed my life, and not only me, but actually came out of that it is a fire which will not diminish, but increase and grow and go on and on and on until it ends with the return of Christ. Because I'm believing that what I see in verse 28 it will come to pass, I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. Your sons, your daughters shall prophesy, your old men dream dreams, your young men see visions. My only thing in that is to say that when I'm preaching, I often say, your age spiritually depends whether you're dreaming or whether you've got a vision. And the trouble today is so many young men are dreaming, and it's the old men, come on, like me, that have got the vision. So your spiritual age is determined by whether you're just dreaming or whether you have a vision. And you know, I'm being driven by a vision. Because right from the beginning, God gave me a clear vision of the revival that was to come. I'd heard of Hudson Taylor's prophecy in 1889, when, although he was a missionary in China, when he came back to England, God gave him a vision one Sunday when he was speaking in a church. And that vision was that in the last days would come a great revival. It would begin in Russia. And the Russians would bring it into Europe. And then the Lord would come back. And the amazing thing is, that's what I've seen. I've seen that revival. I've been part of that revival. And to me, my ministry has been to fulfill prophetic vision. Not just to prophesy. Yeah, there's plenty of people who would prophesy. But when God gives me a prophetic vision, going with it is the command to go out and do it. And you know, it was only that first trip to Israel in 1961 that showed me the need in the communist countries, because people couldn't travel freely. The generation today doesn't understand how difficult things were. In 1961, when we went through Bulgaria, we were literally overnight put in a prison camp. Fortunately, they did let us out. But we saw, and I saw the persecution and the suffering. That's what led me into the Bible smuggling. That's what led me into the ministry. And then, of course, when my overland route into Israel in 1967 was closed by the Six-Day War, I didn't see it as a disaster. God gave me the vision. Right now, use your travel company, your buses and your tourists to spread that gospel right across Eastern Europe. That's why from 1967 onwards, my ministry was not so much now in Israel. My ministry was now all across the former Soviet Empire. 1967, the whole of my work, all my buses were devoted to working in the communist countries. So I was to see what was happening. That prepared me, of course, for the beginning of the breakthrough, which wasn't to come until 20 years later. But, you know, when I look back, I actually sometimes had more freedom to preach the gospel under communism, where I could get permission to rent stadiums. And that's how the revival came in Bulgaria, when I was in that church meeting in Yambul, when the power of God came down. The church was packed to the doors. People were outside standing and trying to get in. And the Holy Spirit came on me. And I know the fire again fell on me that day in Yambul, that Sunday when I was preaching. And from that, I went out. I said, we've got to take a stadium. This is under communism. And when the communist directors said you can't rent the stadium, I prayed and prayed, and in the end they said, we can't rent it to you, we could give it to you for nothing. And how we met the night before in the open air with vine song, and how 10,000 people came, and as the Spirit of God fell, even the day before the crusade began, the Spirit of God fell, and 10,000 people were on their knees asking for forgiveness.